Well, former President Thabo Mbeki is engaging students at Unisa in Pretoria. Let's allow listening.
These sessions that we don't alert people on time that they should come an hour early because they are going to be delayed necessarily because of the checkup. As a consequence of which people arrive 10 minutes before time and then will then spend 20 minutes in the queue. I want to apologize for that. It really was because of the security measures which the police service undertake. That necessarily means we will cut the time for the question and answer session. Necessarily. I must thank the panelists and Professor Msila for these difficult questions they have posed. All of which they relate basically to our continent, all of them. You know, as the first modern African intellectuals, modern ones, emerged in the 19th century, they took up this matter about the future of all Africans on the continent and the African diaspora. I'm mentioning that to say that therefore many of us, I see all sorts of people like with gray hair like Machila and others. As we grew up within this context that our people from, as I say, from the 19th century onwards, have always had a Pan-African perspective. So it's a preoccupation not only about South Africa, but all Africans on the continent and elsewhere. So I'm mentioning that I think we should bear this in mind, that historically this has been the position in our country. That even the liberation movement, historically, the liberation movement has been Pan-Africanist in outlook. It could not but be Pan-Africanist in outlook. That's where we come from. You remember even when the African priests broke away to form their own Christian churches in the 19th century. They called it the Ethiopian Church. It was again within this context of, as these Africans in South Africa, we already always had this perspective that our future of South Africa was intimately tied up with the future of the rest of the continent, as well as the African diaspora. I'm mentioning that in connection with the issue that Omulemu raised about the world order and Africa's role in that context. The role of South Africa, the role of the African Union, and so on. To start off by saying, a part of what's happened, I'm sure that the students here would have observed what I'm about to say, which is this, that over the last few years, as a country, we have walked away from the Africa agenda. That's a reality. Over the years, the focus on the continent and the placement of South Africa within that context has diminished. I know this also because when I go around the African continent, other Africans raise this question. What has happened to South Africa? Why are you walking away from the rest of us? As part of our reality. So the question that Umulemu is raising, what does South Africa do in terms of responding to this world order that is emerging? In a sense, it's an unfair question. Because, as I've said, as a country, we've been walking away even from focus on these Africa questions. Never mind the rest of the world. I think the students also at this university of this African school would also have noticed another phenomenon, which is that the spirit of Pan-Africanism on the continent has also been retreating. You see it everywhere. Not only in South Africa, but elsewhere in the world. Elsewhere on our continent. That spirit of Pan-Africanism is also diminishing. And in a sense, one can understand it. Each one of our countries individually gets preoccupied with only its own domestic challenges. What happens to the rest of the continent, what happens to this Pan-African perspective, recedes. So, Omulemu, you are quite correct. There is something that is happening in the rest of the world which signifies a changing world order. At the beginning of this year, the Secretary of State, United States Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, gave an interview, an interesting interview, in which he said there was a particular period when you had a unipolar world in which United States was a dominant pole, a unipolar world. And he said that period was an aberration. When I read that thing, I stood up and gave Marco Rubio a standing ovation. That you'd get a leader of the United States to say, the unipolar world is, let's not go back there.
Or former President Thabo Mbeki there addressing students at University of South Africa, Unisa.